Good evening. You're very welcome. My name is Brian O'Connell. I'm Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. Provost, Vice Provost, guests, and colleagues. You are all very welcome, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Colin Doherty, who will shortly give the second of our inaugural lecture series in the Faculty of Health Sciences, an honor that is given to full professors appointed to the university. Colin is the Ellen Mayston Bates Professor of Epileptology in Trinity and Consultant Neurologist in St. James's Hospital, as well as Adjunct Professor of Disability in UCD, Honorary Lecturer in Psychology and Visiting Scientist at the RCSI. Anyone who knows Colin will not be surprised at his academic achievements and his appointment as professor. Indeed, reading through Colin's biography, it seems inevitable that he would notch this one up on his academic journey. I don't need to recount to you Colin's march of conquest through clinical academia. The details are crammed into that short biography that you have. But what is clear is his determined focus on improving the care of patients, especially those with epilepsy, and a relentless pursuit of knowledge through his research. Using his Harvard-based training in neurology, Colin not only spearheaded the development of epilepsy services in St. James's Hospital, but also behavioral neurology for people with young onset dementia. He was clinical lead for the National Epilepsy Care Program for 10 years and has advocated constantly for health policy reform and improvements in patient care. As a result, Colin is an advisor or member in a dizzying array of professional and international bodies. This is someone who sees the need for change, has given generously to promote the cause of patient care, and has been a major influence on the national debate. I know that Colin is passionate about putting patients at the center of the health service and to maintain the humanity of care, even as we embrace digital medicine. Colin is also the archetypal triple threat, for he has equally contributed to teaching and research. Author of more than 120 peer-reviewed publications, and with the citations and grants to match, Colin has led and participated in major research projects throughout his career, including as co-PI on the Future Neuro SFI Research Center. He has been equally successful with the whole alphabet soup of IRC, EI, HRB, Epilepsy Ireland, and many, many more. He has received awards too many to mention, including most recently the Kirker Epilepsy Prize from the Irish Neurological Association with his team. Colin has supervised and continues to supervise numerous PhD students. On top of that, I'm told that Colin's ward rounds were always great fun. It's true. Now, as if that wasn't enough, Colin was recently elected as head of the School of Medicine. And Colin, I hope this results in you becoming a quadruple threat and not ending in a quadruple bypass. Many of you will know that Colin runs marathons. He has completed 14 so far. I'm extremely impressed, and so is well placed to accept this challenge as head of school. Though in an ideal world, you might have included some mixed martial arts as well. I look forward to working closely with you, Colin, in the coming years. Finally, it's important to say that Colin has much more going on than a successful clinical and academic career. He is first and foremost a dedicated husband to Sinead, a father to 4 sons, a talented artist and music lover. A colleague has described Colin as a true Renaissance man, curious, well-read, and keenly observant. So Colin, we're very glad that you have brought your talents to Trinity and to the School of Medicine, and we eagerly anticipate hearing about your vision and your perspective for the future. So I now invite you to address the audience with your lecture, A Dark Continent.
So good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be here and don't know what to say. Thank you for such a generous introduction, Brian. So I'm going to take a bit of a risk with this talk. I'm not going to take the opportunity with such a captive audience, people from different backgrounds, different interests, my friends and family in attendance, to demonstrate the awesome power of modern brain science emerging from the combined heroic efforts of the scientists and physicians from the most talented university in the country. I'm not going to brag about how we use mighty tools and our massive intellects to battle diseases of the brain like epilepsy and traumatic brain injury, dementia. Instead, I'm going to show you how we as doctors and scientists are humbled every day by the ongoing mysteries of the brain, and how, despite the perceived progress we've made over the last few centuries in brain science, we remain bamboozled and frustrated, intrigued and resigned by a condition that's so ubiquitous, so everyday, as to be the second most common reason for referral to a neurologist. And yet, it's a condition most of you have never heard of. Now, let me just say that again. It's the second most common reason to be referred to a neurologist, and most of you have never heard of it. Not only that, I will contend, and I will try to prove to you, that this disorder can not only be reasonably credited with the development of the very specialty of clinical neurology itself, but may be considered as the condition upon which the whole ethics of healthcare is realized. And finally, it may be responsible for the often reductive way in which we deal with patients who are suffering, how dismissed, patronized, and abused they are by the healthcare system. So what could I be talking about? Epilepsy, dementia, MS, stroke, these are all common, but none so common in its own right. Migraine is also ubiquitous, but surely could not carry the weight of such history. Of course, the list of less common disorders includes all other brain diseases, you know, brain tumors, Parkinson's disease, motor neuron disease, syncope, muscle diseases, vertigo, even sleep disorders don't cut it. So let me introduce the syndrome with a story, which will weave its way back through the history of the very origins of the specialty of neurology, and how I believe this is a field of study that has led to the moral foundations, not just of healthcare, but maybe of how we lead our lives. It will ultimately make a case for the centrality of an ethics of care in modern medical care, and indeed its education. So the example I will rate happened only a few years ago. I just returned from my training in Boston, and what occurred has only been repeated a few times in my whole career. So it's about 6 o'clock in the morning. I received a call from the acute medical ward at St. James's. Frazzled medical registrar was looking for some advice about a young woman admitted with uncontrolled seizures. Now, she was 22. Let's give her the pseudonym Julie. She'd been admitted the night before, having been found collapsed outside a restaurant where she had worked as a junior chef. The seizures had been going on for 10 solid hours. Big doses of sedating medication, anti-seizure drugs had done nothing. Gave some respite for maybe 30 minutes, the seizures would come back. The movement started up again relentlessly. She had no prior history of epilepsy. She was in general considered extremely healthy. The next steps, having heard of all the therapies that had been used, wasn't clear to me. So I hurried in to get a look at her myself. I entered the ward. I was struck by the ashen-faced parents, a group of bedraggled nurses and doctors, really at a loss of what to do. I examined Julie. Sure enough, when I arrived, she was unconscious. Her eyes were rolling. Every 5 or 10 seconds, she would abruptly jerk. Now, here's a video of something very similar. Now, bear in mind, this is not Julie, okay? This is one of a number of publicly available videos. Remember, this is common. So if you put this into YouTube, you will get hundreds of hits. You can see she's in hospital. She's being monitored. She's unconscious as Julie was, with intermittent jerks of her head and body. I put it to you, the average clinician would be very, very disturbed to stand by and do nothing if this was going on. So I took history again. I learned that she'd been shouted at for mixing up an order. The head chef, compassionate beings that they often are, unceremoniously fired her. She walked out, shocked and bemused, into the street and collapsed, went into seizures. Now, I knew instinctively, as some of the staff did, that she had a condition, this condition I'm talking about. It was not, in fact, epilepsy, a disorder involving spontaneous electrical discharges in the brain. No, it was a seizure, no doubt, but not an epileptic one. This non-epileptic condition has had many names in the history of neurology, including, but not limited to, wait for it, the vapors, the spleen, état dynamique, hysteroepilepsy, hysteria, neurosis, pseudoseizures, non-epileptic attack disorder, psychogenic non-epileptic attack seizures, functional seizures, functional attack disorder. If ever there was something that held up the mirror of ignorance to brain science, it's there are 10 different names for the same condition, many of which are used interchangeably today. Knowing this and seeing it previously, I knelt down beside the bed, took the woman's hand and whispered, "It's okay. You can stop now. Everything will be fine." Stood up, nodded to the incredulous staff, walked out. Sure enough, within 15 minutes, she was awake and alert and back to baseline. Now, I don't tell you this story to paint myself as some sort of disordered brain whisperer. I had no real right to believe this would work, but I also knew that very little else would. But there was at least an even chance that it would have the desired effect. My confidence was that it had only been present for less than 24 hours. The onset was associated with a clear event, the firing, and she had no other prior history. I calculated she was having some sort of physical, psychological reaction to the firing. She did not need big doses of sedating drugs, just help and confidence to come back from the brink of what she thought of as personal dissolution. Now, the other part of the story is that I've gotten this right maybe 1 in 50 times. Mostly such words do no good. The events continue, come and go, sometimes for years, sometimes destroying lives. Neither brain scans, nor blood tests, nor spinal fluid examinations, nor psychological tests can tell us what's going on. In fact, these tests are marked by all how normal they are. Yes, indeed, 70% of people have some sort of physical or psychological trauma in the background, but many do not. Sometimes the trauma is hidden, undisclosed. But why would their brains have such a reaction? And what has modern brain science got to offer this disorder? Unfortunately, very little. Psychologists have done most to try and explain it. Psychiatrists can do little. It doesn't fall easily into categories of anxiety, depression, or psychosis. There's no pharmacological therapies that work. Neurologists, apart from some notable exceptions, are mostly not interested or downright dismissive. By the way, to give you an idea of how ubiquitous this problem is, it's a sister disorder to a range of bodily dysfunctions with no underlying detected abnormality: tremors, choking sensations, brain fog, chronic fatigue, amnesias, paralysis, mutism, blackouts, pains, even chronic pain syndrome sometimes. Patients suffering with these disorders hear the following script. Doctor: "So the good news is all the tests are normal. We can't find any disease process to explain the problem. You've simply got unexplained medical symptoms. However, I'm confident, as you should be, that you'll be fine. Think of it as a stress reaction. So there's no need to come back to me. Go and see your GP." Husband: "Well, honey, what did the doctor say?" Wife, sounding bewildered and scared: "I don't really know, dear. He told me my condition's unexplained. I think he actually thinks I'm imagining it." "What? Imagining having seizures? Of course. He thinks I'm just stressed." "You're stressed? Of course you're stressed. You're falling down every 2 days. Who wouldn't be stressed?" "He told me there was nothing he could do and not to come back to see him." "Oh my God, where can we get some help?" Now, the idea that some sort of extreme emotional states have some sort of physical effect is not, of course, unusual. The pain you get in your gut when you feel you're missing somebody, the pain in your head from concentrating too hard, the tremulousness you feel before your inaugural lecture, the heat and redness in your face when you're embarrassed, or simply the tears streaming down your face when you're happy or indeed sad. These are all true, not imagined effects. They're physical. But consider for a moment if they're not so transient, not so clearly linked to an event or a feeling. Imagine if you were tremulous all the time, or felt like you were choking or unable to breathe, or having blackouts all the time and no one could control it. And there was no stressor you could point to. And what if you went to your doctor and your doctor made you wait a year to see the neurologist, and the neurologist said it's just unexplained symptoms? By the way, don't come back to see me. Now, as a testament to the lack of due diligence paid to these disorders, you should know there are no specialist clinics in Ireland with people trained specifically to deal with these disorders, to at least try to help these people understand them and have their suffering validated, if not treated compassionately. Even internationally, there are a few centres of excellence, notable exception being on these isles being the service led by John Stone in Edinburgh. Pertinent to this school of medicine, there are no scientific departments in any university, including the UK and the US, dedicated solely to understanding this. I find this utterly remarkable. Facing us at every turn, waving, shouting, screaming at us for attention, and yet we ignore it. And it's not just a disorder of modernity, it's been with us for thousands of years. So here's a video of a case from the early 20th century. Now, before I play this, I should say again that this was not found in some dark archive in the basement of a neurology department. It was on YouTube. There's a music track that plays counterpoint to the action. I considered muting the track, but actually I think it's a testament to the lack of seriousness we attribute to this condition that it appears to play out like some silent movie drama. it's 1908. Professor Negro and assistant Rosavend are attending a young woman. See her woman's mask for some unclear reason. Points to her neck. Choking sensation. And a feeling of rising in the chest and neck again. Then watch what happens as the music follows the action. I think I've made my point about how common this is, how poorly understood it is, how poorly treated it is, how poorly communicated it is, and of course, how studiously ignored it is by the health system and academia. But remember, I also claim that it was the driving force of the very discipline of neurology as a specialty. As Carl Sagan might say, extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence. So here goes. So this is the front page of the very first treatise written on this disorder, at least in the English language. It was published in 1603 by Edward Jordan, an influential member of the College of Physicians in London, who wrote about the case of Mary Glover, who lived with her family near the Thames in London. Now, Glover was 13 at the time. One day, she was tasked with delivering a package to her neighbor, Elizabeth Jackson. Jackson disliked Mary for some reason. And when she arrived, Jackson said, quote, rained down imprecations and threats upon the young girl's head and wished as evil death to light upon her. She berated her for an hour and poor Mary was left pale and traumatized. The next time she met Jackson, Mary was immediately caught by the sensation of fullness, choking in her neck. She fought for her breath, unable to swallow. Her neck actually seemed to swell and she grabbed it in distress. Now, the more she came in contact with the dreaded Jackson, the more dramatic the attacks became. Here's another quote from the monograph, and I'll just play a bit of this video while I'm reading it. She turned around as a hoop with her head backwards to her hips, and in that position rolled and tumbled with such violence and swiftness as that their pains in keeping her from receiving hurt against the bedstead and posts were evident. So soon crowds of onlookers would come to see the fits, and after weeks of this, she was brought to the sheriff, who subpoenaed Glover and Jackson to appear before him. Mary, as soon as Jackson arrived, Mary was overtaken by convulsions, and they would not abate until Jackson left. It was not long before a charge of witchcraft was brought against Jackson. Only the deft handling of the case by Jordan saved her from hanging. How many others did not receive such a defense? Jordan wrote that Glover was not possessed, but suffered from hysterica passio, or what he called the suffocation of the mother. He wrote that the condition was common in females due to the movement of the humors upwards from the neck, from the womb up into the neck. Hence the notion of hysteresis, the Latin word for the womb. Now, to understand what he meant by this, we must describe briefly the state of human physiology in the early 17th century. Now, the world was on the cusp of scientific and rationalist revolution. But up until that time, and for about a millennia and a half, 1,500 years, ever since Galen of Pergamon described it in the 2nd century AD, a healthy body meant spiritus naturalis of the liver, the spiritus vitalis of the heart, and spiritus animalis of the brain were all kept in balance by the movement of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black and yellow bile. 1,500 years, that's what we thought happened. Now, this basic view is the reason that purges and bleedings were beloved of physicians of the era. Bleeding someone was regaining balance of the humors. As an aside, it's worth considering that the colonic irrigations and dietary purges beloved of Hollywood celebrities today have their origins in this idea. Now, around this time in Oxford lived a young physician. His name was Thomas Willis. He was an impoverished practitioner serving local villages and towns in the area. He was a royalist during Cromwell's wars, and of course, as such, he couldn't get proper work. But he built his practice up over time, and in his spare time began to dissect the bodies of dead citizens. He took a particular interest in the brain, especially in the anatomy of the brain. He used preservatives which allowed the fine structure of the brain and blood vessels to become visible for the first time. His neuroanatomic work became famous, and he eventually rose to become the Sedleyan Professor of Natural Philosophy, what we know as science today at Oxford. The circle of arteries here at the base of the brain is known to every medical student from their first foray into neuroanatomy as the circle of Willis. It's an anatomical term we use every day in clinical practice when the blood supply to the brain is interrupted by strokes or other conditions. Now, Willis is also credited with introducing the word neurology for the first time to describe a new organ-based approach to diseases of the brain. Now, importantly for my purposes, while Willis is known for his anatomical descriptions of the brain, when it came to understanding neurological diseases, he famously did not initially tackle the diseases of the time, meningitis, neurosyphilis, epilepsy, migraine, but in fact, he concentrated on the very nervous disorders that I've been talking about to date. The ones that remain as enigmatic today as they did in the 17th century. The complexity of his dissections revealed in the brain convinced Willis that the simple movement of humors could not be the defining cause of the illness. He, for one, took grave issue with what he called the wandering womb of antiquity. Quote, "The anatomy of the nerves provides a more profitable speculation than the theory concerning any other part of the animal body, for by means of it, we reveal the true and genuine reasons for many of the actions and passions that take place in our body, which otherwise would seem difficult to explain. The pathologies that produced hysteria and analogous disorders were rooted in the brain, not in some distant reproductive organ. They involved disturbances of sensation, motion, unconsciousness that fell well short of the universal convulsions, a term he used for epilepsy, but were closely related and in the brain, not in the womb." Richard Blackmore, one of Willis's supporters, said, "Those who've never suffered from hysterical fits or hypochondriasis dismissed it as a purely imaginary disorder, and thus patients felt themselves subject to derision and contempt." I think many of us interested in this field of study can attest to the strength of such attitudes among some of the medical fraternity today, let alone 400 years ago. Now, by the time of the 19th century, with little to show in the way of improvement of the suffering of patients with these disorders, the focus in the Victorian era in England moved not only to the physical dimension of the disorder, but also its moral and sexual ones. For physicians of the era, few things were more incontestable that the female of the species was the product and prisoner of our reproductive system. Not only this, but the character of women who suffered from hysteria could be traced back to her lack of rationality, capacity for affection and child rearing, her natural impurity and base moral sensibility. Excitement in the imagination creates nervous excitement, which causes vascular turgescence of the uterine organs, which in turn determines the character of the mental disorder. Now, just like the development of the specialty of neurology can be plausibly traced back to the efforts to understand hysteria, so too, in fact, can the specialty of gynecology. Any gynecologists in the audience? No. The idea that nervous disorders could be initiated by the reproductive organs led to the widespread belief that applying remedies to the external reproductive organs, in reality, sadistic tortures like cauterization of the clitoris, and then the idea of female circumcision was the ultimate answer to hysteria. The English surgeon Baker Brown, a pioneer of the specialty of gynecology, said in 1858, "Loss of nerve power as a result of female masturbation is followed by hysteria, spinal irritation, hysterical epilepsy, cataleptic fits, idiocy, mania, and finally death." Now, no one knows just how many women were castrated by Brown and his acolytes, certainly hundreds, possibly thousands. And he didn't stop until years later when a proper analysis of his surgical outcomes proved that his sadistic interventions had done precisely nothing except increase the quotient of misery of the women of the time. Now, while such horrors were being perpetrated in London in the middle of the 19th century, this time saw the emergence onto the world stage of a physician who can quite reasonably be considered probably the most famous neurologist the world has ever produced. His name was Jean-Martin Charcot. He was the august professor of diseases of the nervous system of the medical faculty at l'Hôpital Salpêtrière in Paris. For obvious reasons depicted in this picture, he was known as the medical Napoleon. At the time of the mid-19th century, Paris was a city of 500,000 people, of which 5,000 resided in Salpêtrière. Louis XIV called it the Versailles of pain. And it was notorious for the forced admission of the disenfranchised female population of the city, beggars, adulteresses, prostitutes, and of course, unwed mothers, who else? But also patients with epilepsy and those with mental disorders. And they lived cheek by jowl in the section of the hospital known as the Hospital for the Epileptic and the Insane. As one can imagine, the so-called hysteric was not uncommon in this group, and it was a condition that intrigued Charcot, possibly because, as a keen anatomist, he was indeed credited with describing the very lesions of multiple sclerosis He prided himself on being able to correlate a symptom with a location in the brain of nerve damage. However, his so-called hysteria seemed to violate all these rules. Such was his interest that he began to demonstrate the features of the condition at his famous or now infamous Tuesday lectures, or Les Camps du Mardi, which became initially nationally and then internationally renowned. The lecture theatre was routinely packed with the great and the good from the worlds of medicine, politics, and the arts, to see a series of Charcot's famous models appear to faint, convulse, or become paralyzed on cue. This is one of the most famous images of the time. The paintings by André Brouillet and dates from 1887. It's one of Charcot's own personal favorites. It shows an exclusively male audience witnessing a hysterical event in his patient Blanche Whitman, who swoons back into the arms of Charcot's assistant Babinski as the professor looks on calmly. Now, Whitman was known to the staff as the queen of the hysterics for her ability to perform on cue. Whitman, when she left the influence of Charcot, became Marie Curie's lab assistant and died of the same radiation-related illness that killed Curie. Charcot's other important contribution was the introduction of hypnotism, invented by another Frenchman, Mesmer, from where we get the word mesmerize, that appeared, at least in some cases, to reverse the syndrome, which spoke to him about the deep-seated psychological nature of the problem and the power of suggestibility. It was to be of intense and bitter disappointment to Charcot, having waited for some of his subjects to die and having examined their brains, he never found a lesion to explain the problem. But for our purposes, it's important to note only two things. Firstly, here again, one of the most famous proponents of clinical neurology, who became world famous not because he discovered MS or Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease or Charcot's joints, nor describing the lesions of neurosyphilis, but again, because of his interest and bafflement over the so-called hysterias. The second important fact, that was for a short time in 1885, a young Austrian visitor sat wrapped in the audience every Tuesday and followed Charcot around in his ward rounds. He was eager to learn everything he could from the master, and Charcot was at the height of his powers. Our visitor arrived from Vienna, aged 29 years old, and was somewhat famous in his own right. He was an anatomist and a scientist. He can be credited with co-discovering the very cellular nature of the brain. His name was Sigmund Freud. There he is there. Now, he looks a little older than 29, but I think you needed to see this picture to recognize it. Now, his influence in the last part of my talk is the most significant. One can only imagine the effect of Charcot's presentations on hysteria had on the fertile mind of Freud. After only 4 months in Paris, Freud returned to Vienna. He did not take up a position in academic practice, but instead opened rooms at 19 Bergstrasse in Vienna, where he lived with his family. Here's a picture of his famous consulting suite with the famous couch in a well-to-do area of the city that remains preserved in the Freud Museum that's on the site today. We know that his practice must have been typical for a turn-of-the-century neurologist dealing with epilepsy and migraine and strokes and dementia, but of course among them must have been many functional cases, and indeed it was these patients in his practice whom he turned to when he revisited hysteria. This is an early publication of Freud's, which concerned his patient whom he gave the pseudonym Dora. Her real name was Ida Bauer. Dora had a range of typical symptoms of the functional realm, and Freud wrote a whole book about her care. And the reason for writing in such detail on these cases was because he and his older colleague, Eugene Bleuler, who later coined the term schizophrenia, and who was also fascinated by hysteria, they both concluded that curing this disease in young women was a meticulous extraction of the hidden details of traumatic experiences in the past. So we can see the idea of hidden repression that came out in later theories of psychoanalysis taking shape. That many of these traumas were considered to be due to sexual repression was perhaps not unexpected. Was it true that middle and upper class women of Vienna were repressed sexually, or at least, as Freud observed, if not repressed, certainly ignorant of sexual matters? Possibly. That was certainly true of their male counterparts also. So this is Freud's first slip. Famous cartoon by B. Clibben. So Freud believed that we never forgot anything. Simply to lie on a couch and recount things unself-consciously really just compounded the lies both that we tell our practitioners, or tell our counselors, and we tell ourselves. He believed that we really had to make a lot more of slips of the tongue and dreams. And he wrote about this in the Psychopathology of Everyday Life. A famous example of a Freudian slip was when Dora used the term cultivate instead of cultivate when speaking of meeting a man she unconsciously found attractive. He interpreted this blunder as evidence that she really meant captivate, in fact, she was captivated by him. I could talk about Freud and his neurological approach to psychoanalysis all night, but I must stick to our theme. Yet again, key pronouncements about from some of the most important figures in the history of neurology and neuroscience are being made again and again about this enigmatic condition that you've never heard of. Then called hysteria, now called functional neurological disorder. Arising before Freud learned about his observations in Paris and Vienna, Freud began to construct a new science of the brain. Inevitably, like all good neuroscientists, he began his deliberations by trying to understand the mind of the infant in explaining psychological trauma. So, Freud simply considered successful development to be marked out by a series of separations. How the child deals with these marks its success or otherwise of development. The first separation is the child from the mother's breast. Freud posits that at first, the so-called id, the ancient inherited self, the one that's full of instincts, can't tell the difference between the self and the object, in this case, the breast. Only learns when it's detached from it that there is an object. Once separated, it realizes this, but more importantly, it's only through the violence of the cry can it be reunited. The ego is that part that eventually differentiates the self from the object and constructs a whole world of self and objects. Freud speculated that all life is defined by separations, and violence, aggression that go along with them is inevitable. This led to Freud's assertion in 1930 when he wrote Civilization and its Discontents, and possibly reflecting the rise of nationalism across Europe. Society can never be at ease with itself, that violence and separation will define the search for happiness in life. Now, it's hard to overestimate the effect of this observation on the theories of development that permeated the new science of psychology, both moral and sexual development of the child, from Piaget in the 1930s all the way to Lawrence Kohlberg in the 1960s. In fact, so pervasive was this idea that it appeared to explain the male hero adventure fantasy embodied in Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. See if this sounds familiar. The hero is called from his lowly place. He's reluctant at first, but he meets his mentor, crosses the threshold after many trials and ordeals, and the death of his mentor and battles with his brother. He finds the road back to redemption, comes home the hero. Now, this is the so-called monomyth, and it was the basis of the draft script that George Lucas wrote in 1977 that became Star Wars. It's the reason all Star Wars movies, in fact, all male hero fantasies appear to be exactly the same. Now, this is all very well, I hear you say, but could this also be the heroine's journey? Well, maybe, but not according to Freud, nor Piaget, nor Kohlberg, and they were working off history here. The fact is that female heroic behaviors did not fit into the hero's journey of separations at all. They never entered trials or combat, nor did they have mentors, nor ordeals, nor dragons, nor lightsabers. Bethelheim points to the strange otherness of the female mythologies. Once they reached womanhood, they fell asleep, Sleeping Beauty, went into comas, Snow White, were banished to the tower or banished to the basement, Cinderella. They literally went missing. WTF, as Phil Dunphy would say, why the face? Freud, a product of his time after all, was similarly baffled by female development, and he goes as far as to call female sexual and moral development paraphrasing H.M. Stanley, who referred to Africa as such a place in the 19th century. He simply did not understand it and explained the fact that the mother is compelled by the crying child to latch the baby back on as simply excess of narcissism. Now, I hope you've noticed throughout this talk my not so subtle emphasis on the history of male physicians and scientists speculating on what could possibly be going on with women in these states. If you've noticed that, you're not dreaming. I think it's reasonable to say that our potted history of neurology has demonstrated a barely concealed estrangement from women, their minds and their bodies, from the so-called hysteric, the wandering womb of antiquity, the fallen women of the Salpêtrière, the sadistic castration of women in London by Baker Brown, sexual inhibitions of middle-class Viennese women. In fairness, there were notable exceptions to the rule that hysteria was a woman's problem, including Willis and indeed Charcot, who saw the condition in the stressed-out working-class male population in Paris. It was also noted by Weir Mitchell, who's the so-called father of American neurology, in Veterans of the American Civil War. It's just it couldn't be called hysteria, right? Men did not have wombs. but it was called other things: the spleen, hypochondriasis, neurasthenia, weakness of the nerves. After World War I, it became known as shell shock. So here are some men who survived the front. Note the tremors and abnormal gaits. The treatment of these men, if they were not shot for cowardice, was similarly sadistic, with electrodes being placed on their genitals and in their throats, literally tortured. If you'd like to read more about shell shock, I could not recommend more highly Pat Baker's The Ghost Road. So, despite this and the fact that some people realized that men also had this, Freud's view of the dark content of female sexuality and moral development was permeating this field of psychology. The most influential name in the field of psychology after this was Piaget. Sorry, after Piaget was Lawrence Kohlberg, who did seminal work in the 1960s and 70s. And he came up with these 6 stages of moral development. Starting in infancy, the child tries to just avoid punishment. Then there's self-interest, followed by a recognition that there are laws, which mean justice for all. Finally, he moves to bind himself to the social contract, which means fairness and reciprocity to fellow citizens, demands certain rule following. But the pinnacle is to act as a rational, autonomous, self-actualized being and use principle, even if it somehow violates the law occasion, to make the most moral decision available. His conception was that the child developed between the infancy and about 11 years to this apex of moral development. He published widely in the child development literature, and his famous thought experiment was the so-called Heinz dilemma. So I'm going to use this drawing, which is one of my favorite drawings by Kathy Kollwitz, an anti-fascist artist from the Second World War. Here's a father fretting over his dying child. So the Heinz experiment is that Heinz is the father. He learns that a local pharmacist has developed a cure for the condition. But he's charging an exorbitant amount of money and for the drug. And the experiment, Kohlberg asks this and other questions to 11-year-olds to see what they would choose to do. In the famous example, Jake, a young man from a middle-class family, whose father was a doctor, who wants to be an English major, was asked what he would do. And after vacillating briefly, Jake confidently announces that stealing the drug is a moral thing to do. And according to Kohlberg, this was the correct answer. This was the rational, autonomous moral decision, stage 6 in the hierarchy of morality. In his summary of the 84 children the tests were proposed to, only a minority, about 30%, reached these lofty heights, but Kohlberg was unperturbed. This fit his notion of leadership and talent rising to the surface in society. Now, in his lab at the time was a young graduate student named Carol Gilligan, and she wondered, where's the date on the girls? So it turns out Kohlberg did ask 11-year-old girls about the dilemma, but their answers are frustratingly fraught with what ifs, buts, maybes. They could see the situation only over time, considering that Heinz stole the drug and then he went to prison. What about the next dose? And what would happen to the rest of the family? Amy, the intelligent young woman, wanted to be a scientist, saw the problem in terms of relationships of all the protagonists. She did not think stealing was the answer. She was convinced the druggist would be persuaded to be compassionate. This is no good for Kohlberg. His formulation of what was going on was that girls could never get out of stages 3 and 4. The good girl, law and order, model citizen. In Kohlberg's eyes, as in the rest of psychology world at the time, women were seen as lesser moral beings, constantly preoccupied by relationships in the past and the future. They were constitutionally unable to make rational, autonomous decisions based on the facts. Now, Gilligan, his student, remember, looked askance at this conclusion. Women could not, by this scale, attain the same level of moral maturity as men. What began as Freud's dark continent ended with seemingly irrefutable conclusions. Gilligan wondered, well, you know, maybe it's not that women fall short. Maybe your theory's wrong. From this, Gilligan set out on her own to prove Kohlberg's conclusions wrong. In 1993, she wrote her experience of this work in a book called A Different Voice. And that work and the work of other women in child development grew the concept of the new moral plateau, which Joan Tronto and Bernice Fisher called an ethics of care. Attentiveness, responsibility, competence, responsiveness, and plurality. They constructed a theory that was about connection, not about separation, about relationships weaving in and out over time, not about autonomous moral clarity, about love and compassion, not simply about justice and fairness. Now, I'm pretty sure, apart from maybe Mick McKay and Ger Murphy, there are no Carol Gilligan, Joan Tronto experts in the audience. Yet we all recognize that the ethics of care in how we deal with our children and our loved ones. No one declares grounding your teenager as like fair and just and moral. We just get on with it. The ethics of care recognizes the value of tough love and the inherent care in such sanctions. It's not that we're not familiar with the ethics of care and that Gilligan was the first to think of it. It's just that it has been relegated through history to a position of being a woman's ethic, the ethics of the home. It's not fit to bring into the clinic or the school or the university or, God forbid, the parliament. But why the bloody hell not? If you think of I'm overplaying my hand here, just look at the people who do the caring in our society. Nurses, teachers, family members, care assistants, foster parents, social workers, domestic workers. Ask, how do they stack up in terms of pay and conditions, even standing in society to doctors, lawyers, scientists, politicians, sportsmen and women, celebrities, heads of schools, and even provosts. If you were paying attention to the head of school election, you'll know that my engagement with the school's electorate revealed a lot of people concerned rightly about fairness, justice, and reciprocity. But there was also a barely concealed concern about connection and care. And I have nothing against fairness and justice, but it's a highly subjective notion. I know if I asked a Donald Trump supporter if he thinks his support is fair and just, we all know what the answer would be. So let's examine Toronto's categories of an ethics of care compared to the fairness and justice ethic in relation to the physician looking after a patient with the type of disorder we've been talking about. So instead of being laser focused on the rational, autonomous, impersonal, yet morally unimpeachable approach to take, you are actually fully attentive to the needs of the person in front of you. Not only this, but you feel responsible to help, not just obliged by your position. You actually genuinely feel responsible to help. Not only this, but you're competent to do so, meaning you've been properly trained to deal with the condition, but also responsive. In other words, you move to deploy your knowledge and tools at your disposal to effect the changes required, not delay or invoke others to do the changing. And then finally, instead of knowing what is right for this patient based on your vast experience of this disorder and using the evidence you've assimilated, pronouncing impersonally the best possible treatment for this individual, you demonstrate plurality to their needs. What do they want? How can what you propose fit into their idea of wellness and illness? Now imagine if we had valued such an ethic of care in other aspects of our lives, in education and politics. I have a sense that the new provost in TCD understands this and wants to drive such an ethics of care in the university, and she'll have an ally in me in that. What about the environment, the seas and the forests? What if we were attentive to the oceans, felt genuinely responsible to fix them, had competent people to enable to fix them, release them to act without delay, and not only that, but we also understood and took account of the livelihoods of those who must make their living from the sea. Bruno Latour, the French philosopher, talked about having a parliament, not just of people, but of things. Why not? So all this history has brought me to this point. A neurological syndrome, once known as hysteria, now called functional neurological disorder. It's so ubiquitous as to be practically hidden in plain sight. So common that it eclipses nearly every... That it eclipses nearly all other referrals to a neurology outpatients, and yet you've never really heard of it as a neurological disorder, not one that ruins lives or at least has increased mortality, which it does. I think I've shown that the disparaging sexist notion it's really a female problem has led us to a complete and utter failure of science. We've learned practically nothing about it in the last 400 years. We've no specialists employed to deal with it, although there is expertise out there. We've no departments of research dedicated to the problem, although there are some researchers interested in it. There's no understanding of the basic pathophysiology, except that it does not obey the basic rules of pathophysiology or anatomical localization. In 1927, Peabody said that the secret of healthcare is care, simply that, to care. Had our history of this problem been marked more by care than by mere curiosity, then maybe we would have made more progress by now. So before I finish, I'm going to tell you two tales of care that could restore your hope for the future. So this is another video. I made this video, which I socialized on Twitter about a year and a half ago. It's of a patient journey created by one of my younger colleagues who has taken on this dark continent of functional disorders. But not only that, has brought the kind of ethics of care we need to understand it. So it traces a young woman's journey over 2 years, from June 2018 to 2020. After presenting with recurrent blackouts and spells, and getting a diagnosis of PNES, which is psychogenic non-epileptic seizures, one of the terms we've used. She wrote down, she stood back and she took up 9 feet of our department wall and decided she's going to put down the journey this woman had gone through. So these are down the left, all the various aspects of care And you can see as we pull back, every single one of these columns here is an interaction with the health system, either an emergency room visit, GP visit, falling, collapsing, goes on and on and on and on. So after 2 years of multiple admissions, multiple tests, finally the diagnosis becomes clear. She identifies the triggers that are causing it. She understands its provenance. Routine tests are cancelled. She's linked in with the psychology service and it continues to come to see us at the clinic. This is what real care looks like. This is what we should be doing for all of our patients. And I'd like to thank Aoife, who did this. At least I made the video, but Aoife did it all. And that's Aoife Laffin, who's just joined our department. So the second tale of care concerns this. Nick McKay is also an expert on this. Wolverhampton Wanderers in the 1980s. This is the team photo. They were in the first division, English division, 1980, before the Premier League existed. One of these men would find himself falling into a long spiral of alcohol addiction, multiple head injuries, a stroke in his 40s, homelessness, living on the streets of Dublin. He would regularly be admitted to St. James's Hospital with fits, some of which were epileptic, some of which were not. For years, I would come by, having been asked to opine by the medical team. Is there anything we can do? I would just shrug my shoulders and tell the students and junior doctors that certain futility to this, you know? I mean, we're just nipping at the edges here about changing medication. It's a whole system problem, you know, it's a social problem. Epilepsy, we can't do anything about this. So this dark sense of futility followed me around on rounds for years, many patients getting admitted with this kind of problem. And one day I met a young physician called Trinity. Now, some of you know her. Anyway, she's obviously brilliant, competent, great researcher, but that's not what was special about her. In James's, we've more than our fair share of brilliant people, but she was remarkable at Clina was simple compassion she showed for her patients. By the way, her patients would generally test the patients of Job. Homeless, men mostly, also women, multiple morbidities like addiction and the kind of dissembling and lying that goes on to oneself that goes with that. Anxiety, psychosis, head injuries, cognitive impairment, liver, heart, skin and kidney diseases to boot. They are patients who are disenfranchised, forgotten, abused and impoverished. Patients who must have done such unspeakable things for their own families to disown them. This is a drawing I did of the hand of a Polish man who was in a coma in James's after being assaulted in Dublin. He was only 37, he was an alcoholic, living on the streets of Dublin. He had one phone number in his belongings. It was a Polish number, it was his sister. Every time we rang her, she would hang up. Their only friends are their co-conspirators in self-destruction. Clina Nicalic cared for them, addressed one problem at a time and never lost hope. So one day I went to the team I worked with in James's. This is them, mostly from the epilepsy division, but other people as well. Down in the bottom right there, that's where we do all our work, those porta cabins. So anybody who gives me jip about their working conditions, that's where I've been for 15 years. But I just went to these people and I said, look, we just need to love these people and then we'll make the right choices. So they got together, in particular, Cara Sinnott, Elizabeth Doran, Raluca Stanila, Enda Barron from the Community GP Service Safety Net. They spent 4 years bringing all the stakeholders together and they designed a pathway of care for their fits and neurological disorders. And it resulted in this paper in the BMJ Quality Open, which is just one publication I'm most proud to be associated with. Of course, we have not fixed the problem, but we've applied an ethic of care. We have made progress. We've emerged from our own darkness to help them from theirs. I've shown this slide to you before. It's a picture of Avidis Donabedian. He was an Armenian Jewish refugee who was the father of the so-called quality in healthcare movement. And his watchword was structure plus process equals outcome. And he would look at every process in the health system and make sure that it fit into this paradigm. It was only when he was dying of cancer in a lonely hospital ward in the 1990s that he realized he was missing something. Systems awareness, systems design, these are important for health professionals, but they're not enough. They're enabling mechanisms only. It is the ethical dimensions of individuals that are essential to a system's success. You have to love your patient, you have to love your colleagues, you have to love your profession. If you have love, you can work backwards to monitor and improve the system. This is a picture of my mother, Patricia, with her two beloved sisters, her partner and her brother-in-law. Patricia's in purple, standing out as usual. Nuala is the oldest sister in red on the left. Then Terry, Patricia's partner, is holding the flowers. In the middle is Berna, who looks very ill. Ted, her husband's on the far right. This was taken during a same-sex civil partnership in Ireland in 2011, when Patricia joined with her partner, fellow artist Terry. The legislation was due to be enacted in June of that year. In February 2011, Patricia lobbied successfully so they could have the ceremony before Berna passed away. She died 2 weeks later. For this reason, it was probably the very first civil partnership in Ireland, although there was no publicity about it. Nuala has since died, and Patricia is now the only surviving sibling of 6. As a painter, this is a piece of her work she did in the 1980s that reflects the impersonal nature of healthcare in relation to women's health from that time. The painting is pretty special to me. Last winter, Patricia finally got the recognition she deserved. The Irish Museum of Modern Art came looking for her. They want to do a retrospective show, a particular interest in her activist and feminist art of the 1980s. This show is going to open in February 2023. You're all invited. The gallery had a photo of this, and they really wanted this to be in the show, and Patricia had mislaid it. She had this habit of loaning out her work and forgetting who she gave it to. So she called me up. Will you put the news out on Twitter, Colin? She says, see if anyone knows where it is. She had this idea that I had a wide following in social media. And sure enough, when I posted it, I got 12 likes and 1 retweet. He turned up, believe it or not. It was sitting on a wall of an old friend's house. He was one of the 12. Why it's important is it's an emblem of how the ethics of care becomes a political statement. Just like her pushing the boundaries in civil partnership. There's a long way to go, but the changes in Ireland in relation to women's health and the control of their bodies has changed hugely, and Patricia's work is a reminder of where we were and takes aim at where we need to be. More than anyone else in my life, I believe that Patricia's idea is not just about the ethics of care, but its political significance has influenced my conception of modern medicine. It might explain why I want to tackle the head of school, to walk away in a few years, people knowing that at the very least, what I think is important is not self-actualization, research success or rankings, but love and care. I'm essentially finished now, but I reserve the right to thank a few people before we leave. And here's a slide I made for my interview for this chair of epileptology. On the far left there, you'll see the enigmatic Ellen Mayston Bates, whose bequest the chair is named after. We don't know very much about Ellen. She was a TCD alum, and she left this incredible gift to create the chair. Below are some former heads of school, intellectual giants in the world of medical education, Dermot Kelleher, Michael Gill. There's no picture of Paul Brown. Believe it or not, there's no picture of Paul Brown in the world. So I couldn't put him up there. They all helped to get the bequest through council, and I stand on their shoulders quite precariously. Here's my colleague Orla Hardiman, whose influence has been huge on me. And then from the Trinity Foundation, then Nick Sparrow and Jean O'Cleary. The bubbles represent the influence on my professional and academic career over my time from Dublin to Boston and back again. It's a slide that demonstrates, I hope, more powerfully relationships than achievement. Now, here's some quick flashes of my extended family. Is my dad. I didn't get to talk to him about his influence, but it was big. Brothers and sister, stepmother, my other brother, and his little restaurant, which is fantastic, called Assassination Custard. You should all go. These are all the nephews and nieces and stepsister, stepbrother, and all the other family members, extended family. If your photo's not up there, it's because I didn't have a photo of you. This is my wife's family, who I'm very close to, and in particular, a picture of John Wilson, my father-in-law, who had a very big influence on me personally, and he died last year. That's me winning a competition in Butlins. These are people who are both friends, family, and influences on me in my thinking about healthcare. All of these people, some of them have passed away, some of them are very much alive, but they've all had a role in making me think differently. Again, if you don't see yourself up here, it's not because I didn't think of you, it's because I didn't have a photo of you. But thank you to all those people. And then, of course, I want to introduce these amazing, gorgeous, inspiring, infuriating, perennially hungry, unbelievably messy young men. From left to right, Jack, Cormac, Owen, and Milo. And there's Milo standing, he's 6'5", standing beside my 4-year-old nephew, Owen. He's a great kid, you know, but he's only 4. He's been learning Spanish for a year, and but he still can't say the word please, which you think is poor for 4, right? I promised one dad joke. Then, of course, finally, I have to show you pictures of Sinead, midwife, nurse specialist, mother, sister, and beloved friend, the person who really keeps me grounded. This is us on the Staten Island ferry back in 2002, and that's us with the boys. Sinead's ethics of care is so ingrained, she doesn't even notice it in herself. Thank you for being you. Thank you, everyone.
Colin, thank you so much for such a thoughtful and thought-provoking and entertaining, and I think covering so much in that. I think there's a lot there that we can talk about and go on with outside. Colin will be available for book signings and chat afterwards. Thank you all so much for coming. It's been our pleasure. I think you will agree with me that we have got a bargain here in being able to attract Colin and his intellect to Trinity. So thank you so much.